Hi, I'm Roger Evernden and welcome to this webinar, which is using Togaf to implement a successful enterprise architecture. I've been working with Good e-learning for many years now. They're a company that provides market-leading accredited training. It's user-oriented. And one of the things I like very much about them is that they work with industry leaders and experts to help get the really best knowledge and information out there for you. If you want to take advantage of any of their courses, there's a discount code. It's at the bottom of the screen right now. So here's the agenda for today. I'm going to start off by asking, do you want to be successful, and have a brief look at what it means to be successful and how Togaf can help. I'm then going to look at 7 characteristics of successful enterprise architecture projects. Then we go on to look at 10 tactics which will increase your chances of success with Togaf. 3 things that the Togaf certification doesn't tell you, but you really need to know about. Then I'm going to go back over some of the successful key takeaways that we've covered in this webinar, and we'll open it to discussion. So do you want to be successful? I'm going to start with a quote by Mark Twain. All you need in this life is ignorance and confidence, and then success is sure. Well, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, and hopefully by looking at Togaf and learning about how to do enterprise architecture, you won't be ignorant, but you'll have a whole lot of knowledge that's available. But you do need some confidence. And let's have a look at some of the other factors that come into making a successful project in any field, really. So success really is accomplishing some sort of aim or purpose. It's the way in which we measure success. How do we measure succeeding? So doing your best, believing that you can. That's one way to try and be successful. Certainly you want to make the most of the skills and talents and ability you have. Setting clear goals. If you don't know what it is that you're trying to achieve, how would you know whether you've been successful? So focusing on the priorities, focusing on the things that matter most. Being realistic. We can all try to be successful, but if we don't understand the difference between what is possible and what we might like to achieve, but which isn't practical, then we may never actually achieve success. So understanding the difference between what we need and want and the possibility. And sometimes it's important at the outset of a project to say, this isn't possible. If you try to cover everyone's needs, even though they're not practical, then you may be setting yourself up for failure. Persistence, sometimes, especially in enterprise architecture, because projects are often long-term, we need to be persistent. We need to hang in there, and we may need to take it a stage at a time and possibly lose a few battles to eventually complete and win the project that we are achieving. It's important to understand what is within your control and what you can influence and what you can't. So it's important to know who's on your side and how you can get them to work with you to be successful. And it's important perhaps to remember that success is relative. Even when we do something which isn't perhaps quite as successful as we might have liked, there's relative success and we can learn from failure. And sometimes, especially with big enterprise architecture projects, you need to try something out and perhaps realise that it's not practical, it doesn't work, but learn from it and then go on to achieve success with the eventual solutions. And it's important to remember that it's a team thing. We depend on many other people, some of them within the enterprise architecture team itself, but in enterprise architecture it's an enterprise project, so you have a whole load of people that you need to work with: project managers, IT people, business people, end users. So let's have a look at some of the characteristics of a successful enterprise architecture project. Most enterprise architecture projects have a great number of stakeholders. You're not trying to satisfy just one person, you're trying to deal with the needs and desires of quite a wide range of people. Occasionally there are projects which have got a few sponsors, but generally speaking, you're dealing with a lot of different people. Enterprise architecture projects tend to cover multiple domains. By that I mean that they're not just changing, updating an application or changing a process or something that's a single domain event. We're actually looking at a major change which is going to affect applications and processes and infrastructure and all sorts of other factors. Enterprise architecture projects tend to be quite complex. They're not simple changes. Doing a simple upgrade, that's not really an enterprise architecture project. It might put the latest version of an application in place or the latest version of a piece of software, but it's not really changing or modifying the architecture, and that tends to be a more complex event. And a lot of enterprise architecture projects are long in duration. You're typically going to be doing something which is at least a year, maybe 2 years, 3 years in duration. Occasionally there are shorter projects, and in a big project there are going to be stages which you implement in a shorter time frame, but the end result is usually of long duration. So let's have a look at some characteristics which can help us to manage projects which have many stakeholders, cover multiple domains, are complex and of long duration. Well, all of this complexity, the large numbers of people, etc., that can be offset by our abilities. And these are things we can learn. So our ability to work with uncertainty and complexity. There's quite a degree of uncertainty in any enterprise architecture project. It's usually something that you've never tried to do before, so you don't know for sure what the outcome will be. Then there's the need to work with multiple options and multiple possibilities. There's often more than one route that you can take to get to the end result, and sometimes you need to change route on the way. It's a little bit like going on a journey by car. If there's roadworks or there's an accident, you need to change direction. And that's also true with enterprise architecture projects. When you come across something that's a stumbling block, you might need to look at one of the alternative ways of ending up with your result. When you're looking at stakeholder concerns and all the different needs of multiple people, you need to be able to deconstruct those concerns. You need to be able to break them down into their component parts and see where there are overlaps and try and build a consensus that brings all of those concerns together. And you need to manage the outcomes of more than one team, the enterprise architecture team, the IT team, the project management, the business people, through a master plan. So that's 4 things, 4 characteristics of successful enterprise architecture projects. It's teams that have that ability to work with complexity, manage multiple options, deconstruct the concerns and stakeholder needs and understand consensus, and manage outcomes of many teams through a master plan. There are also some things to do with organisation culture that we can see are common across many successful enterprise architecture projects. So it's important to have good people, management, executive teams, who understand how an enterprise architecture approach works. Doesn't mean they have to be experts in enterprise architecture, but it does mean they have to be sympathetic to the notion of using enterprise architecture. If you're struggling in an organisation which doesn't fully embrace enterprise architecture, it's going to be much harder. There need to be appropriate governance structures and processes in place. And I don't mean that you need to have too much control and too much governance, but you need to have enough, and it needs to be the right sort so that you can get the work done. Some teams build very complex procedures for checking things and ensuring that everything's signed off, and it's just too much, and it causes, to some degree, less successful projects. And you need a solid support environment, and by that I mean you need tools, you need ability to share and provide information to people. All of those things need to be in place so that you've got effective ways of communicating. So here are 7 characteristics which are true for pretty much every successful enterprise architecture project. Now, let's look at 10 tactics which you can use from Togaf, which will help to increase the possibility of success. And the first one I'm going to put up is governance. And there's a whole sections and quite a lot of information in the Togaf documentation about architecture governance and how governance fits in with the architecture and enterprise governance in general. So governance really is keeping track of things. So governance really is keeping track of things, keeping track of progress, keeping track of decisions. So it's important to actually keep this information to ensure that everyone understands what decisions have been made, to make sure that the right decisions are made and things like that. Now, there's a lot of good material in Togaf that you can use, but it's important not to overcomplicate things. What's written in the Togaf documentation is all essential. It's all important that you have these things in place. So you have processes, you have all of the decision points, you have all of the artifacts which help make decisions, but you can overcomplicate. So a good example of that is where you have lots and lots of people involved in reading and checking documentation and making sure it conforms to policy guidelines or rules and regulations within the organisation. That's partly important, but what you can do in enterprise architecture is set up patterns and set up artifacts which become self-checking so that you are able to simplify that process of governance, and you don't spend too long doing the checking, you spend more time actually doing the architecting and making sure that's right in the first place. And a key part of that is making sure that everyone is responsible. The enterprise architecture team can't take on the full responsibility for the success of your project. It's a real team effort, so everyone has to be involved. A key factor in governance is making sure that all of the right people are involved at the right times. So, for example, one thing you can do very early on in a project is make sure that everyone knows what their responsibilities are, everyone knows what the governance process is, so that they don't come back to you later and say, but we didn't know, we didn't understand that's how it's going to go. Here's a second thing that Togaf gives you, which really helps, and that's the architecture development methodology. That's the process, that's how we architect, the process of architecting. And it's not a hard and fast, these are the rules that you must follow each one of these steps. It's adaptive, it's iterative. And Togaf emphasised this over and over again, that you need to adapt Togaf to your needs. You need to iterate to be able to achieve your objectives. So it's important to bear in mind those factors when you're using the ADM. But it is a very good template of the key things that you need to do within an architecture development project. Sometimes you need to go faster, sometimes you need to go slower around that ADM. Sometimes you need to do a very quick iteration to get the high level overview of what it is you're going to achieve. And it's important to do that really fast within the first week, 2 weeks, first month or so, just so that everyone knows exactly what's going on. So that's what I mean by using the ADM. You don't just use it in one way, you use it in multiple different ways. And when you're using it, sometimes you do very detailed studies and sometimes less detailed. A key thing to remember about the ADM, it is a process, But the key things you're doing at the beginning of the ADM, you're finding out what's wrong with the architecture as it is at the moment. And you're also finding out what you need to do to the architecture to make it work in the future. So that's finding the constraints in the present, in the current architecture, and looking at the enablements or the opportunities and the possibilities in the target architectures. Now, third thing that we get in Togaf, artifacts. These are the tools that you communicate with, so they have to be really good. The better your artifacts, the easier your communications to all of the different stakeholders, all of the people who are building and developing your architecture. And there's a very good diagram, I'm showing it on the screen here, that shows the link between the artifacts and the architecture. So remember that the architecture is described by the artifacts. A lot of people create artifacts which don't describe the architecture. They're descriptions of an issue or a problem, but they don't say what is it about this architecture that is causing those problems or issues. What is it about this new architecture which will relieve those problems? And each of those artifacts, each of those descriptions has to link to stakeholders and their concerns. So if you get all those links together, it's much easier to do the communications. Now, artifacts are not too well described in Togaf. There are some artifacts in Togaf, the ones that are in Togaf are quite good, but there's a whole host of other ones that are out there. So it's really important that you create your own artifacts. They need to be relevant to your needs. They need to be practical. They need to work with the stakeholders that you need to communicate with, and they need to be insightful. So Togaf describes the notion of artifacts. Togaf explains how they fit into the scheme of things, but you need to come up with the artifacts that will work for your project to make it successful. The key thing there is don't make them obscure. Don't make them partisan. If it's an artifact which is way too technical and business people don't understand it, it's not going to work. You have to create artifacts which work in the communication task that you're setting them to. So let's go on now to roadmaps and scenarios. Now, Togaf again doesn't spend a lot of time looking at roadmaps. And incidentally, when I say that Togaf doesn't do these things too well, that's exactly the time when you need to go and see what support information is available. And Good eLearning are very good at doing that because they have a whole host of experts who provide all sorts of information to help bolster that basic set of things that Togaf provide. So roadmaps and scenarios, these are really, really important. This is how you describe the path from where you are at the moment. So you're describing the concerns, the constraints of the current architecture. You're going to a future target architecture. You're describing the possibilities within that architecture, and you're looking at the route to get there. It's important to think about alternative routes. So remember, I mentioned at the outset, one of the key success factors is being flexible, being able to change if circumstances change, or if you come up to some sort of unexpected problem. You need to have alternative routes that you can take, and it's good to work these out at the beginning. Key thing that you must remember, they must be mapped. Every single step of the roadmap, of the route map, must be mapped to architectural states and patterns. When we describe an architectural state, this is the current state of the architecture, this is the target state of the architecture. Effectively, we're describing a pattern, we're describing a set of constructs, a set of entities which make up the architecture. So the roadmap must explain what each step is looking like and how you make the transition to the next one. Now, to help you do that, the fifth thing that Togaf gives you is a meta model. Absolutely everything in enterprise architecture maps to the meta model. The meta model is the model of the architecture, essentially. Essentially, the meta model describes all of the different constructs which are then used to create and form and manage the architecture. So you need to have a good meta model. Togaf have a pretty good basic core meta model. It has a whole load of different extensions, so it's a very, very good starting point. It will give you a lot of information that you need to develop your own meta model. Again, as with everything else, you have to create the meta model that actually maps to your organization. So it's the basis for describing the problems, the concerns, the constraints, the limitations. Every time there's a concern, you map it. You say, which part of the meta model, which part of the architecture is the thing that's causing or contributing to this problem? And it's also the same meta model that you use to plan future states, patterns and architectures. So by having that as a common core, it means it's so easy now to actually start to see how transitions take place. Now, the basic model that you've got in Togaf is a good one. It's a great starting point, but again, you might need to adapt it. If you're using various tools for enterprise architecture, they often also have their own meta model as the foundation for the tool and how information is captured within that enterprise architecture tool. So the next point, number 6, Togaf talks about a stakeholder map. It talks about the concerns and needs, and there's a very useful diagram that I've shown you here, which covers all of the key areas where you're going to find stakeholders, ranging from the chief executive and the top executive board of the organization through all of the different project organizations, the end users and the system organizations. Managing stakeholders can be a huge task. It can overburden a good enterprise architecture team. If you're doing a big project, you're going to have a lot of stakeholders. They're going to have all sorts of needs, but they're not necessarily going to have the same needs. So it can be hideously diverse. How do you manage that? One simple way, and Togaf doesn't tell you this, is that you can manage the needs, manage the stakeholders hierarchically. What I mean by that is if you've got a group of business people and they all have the same needs, you can group them together and you can then combine their needs. Instead of describing the individual needs of each business person, you describe them at the next level up the hierarchy as a group of people. So this group of people have the same needs. You can then take their needs and maybe the IT department needs. Now they're probably going to be different in many respects, but there are always some aspects of their needs which you can take up the hierarchy and find that they have them in common. The more you can push needs up the hierarchy into common needs that everyone subscribes to, common concerns that everyone has, the easier it is to manage. So if you imagine your hierarchy, at the tail of the hierarchy, you've got all the needs which are specific to a group or an individual. They're more diverse, they're harder to manage. The more things you can push up the hierarchy, the easier it is to manage them together. The next thing we have in Togaf are some techniques. Things like the business transformation readiness assessment, things like gap analysis. Again, a lot of good things described in Togaf, but again, you need to develop your own list. You need to customize this, and the more techniques you can find, especially if they're really effective communication tools, especially if they're really good at understanding the problems with the current architecture and the need to transition to a different architecture pattern or state. If you've got tools that help you to do that, and they're good communication tools, you will be more successful with your architecture projects. So start with the Togaf list, but develop your own and customize. Now, very often you want some inspiration, you want some ideas, you're perhaps feeling a little bit alone in this mammoth task that you've been set, and you want some help and some guidance. Now, Togaf provides all sorts of examples and stories that can inspire you and give you ideas. And as time goes on, there are more and more of these stories in the Togaf documentation, but you can also find them elsewhere. If you look at enterprise architecture conferences, or if you look at some of the journals that describe enterprise architecture, you can find plenty of examples that will inspire you and give you ideas. So if you look in the Togaf library, you'll find, as well as the Togaf standard, there are all sorts of things like white papers, webinars, reference cards. Another good source of stories is actually to look at the Togaf examination itself. And when you do the Togaf examination, you're given some scenarios. Some of those multiple choice questions are, here's a scenario, this is what the enterprise architecture team are doing, what would you do? And it gives you a number of options, and you have to choose the one that you think is the most appropriate according to Togaf. Those are also very good at giving you a flavour of how people architect. So that all of those examples, all of those stories can help to inspire you and help you, give you a flow of what you need to do in your project. Those examples help you because you realise you're not alone, but you are not alone. Togaf is a community. The Enterprise Architecture Group have a forum where members can join. If you're an individual and you're certified as an enterprise architect, then you're part of a community of enterprise architects. And there are plenty of forums out there. If you go to LinkedIn, you can find all sorts of community groups that you can join. And if you've got a real issue or problem, ask someone, put a question out there, find out what comes back. You'll find that most architects are really forthcoming. They love the subject matter that they're working with. They like to talk about the subject, and so they're really willing to pass on their advice and their guidance and help you. And then the final thing that I put there for increasing your chances of success with Togaf is that it's important to perhaps remember that the Togaf certification is a de facto standard. There are other architecture certifications out there, but by far and away Togaf is the most popular and the most well known. So when you're trying to gain commitment to something you're doing, when you're trying to get buy-in with other people within the organization, you can use the authority, the credibility of Togaf to help get you there. But, and here's a really important proviso, it's important to remember that Togaf is always developing a little bit behind the times and is never going to be a complete guide to everything to do with enterprise architecture. So you need to keep learning, you need to go on courses, you need to, as well as becoming Togaf certified, you need to go on courses that will help keep your knowledge up to date, give you new techniques, give you new artifacts that you can use, and take your understanding of architecture into future situations. So those are my 10 recommendations as tactics using Togaf. There's a lot of good documentation there, and you can learn all about it with Good e-Learning. They do a great range of courses that cover all of those basics within the Togaf standard. But as I mentioned a couple of times, there are some things that Togaf doesn't tell you, and it's important to know about these. And that's part of keeping yourself up to date and learning all the best things that you can do to make your project a success. So Togaf, just by its label, it sounds like it's the architecture framework, the open group architecture framework. But it's not the only architecture framework. There are plenty of architecture frameworks. Essentially, an architecture framework is just a body of knowledge, a range of techniques and tools, a set of processes. It's how we architect. It's all of that overview, that structure that we use to help us to manage architectures effectively. So go and have a look, see what other techniques and ideas are out there that Togaf doesn't cover. For example, Togaf doesn't describe patterns very thoroughly or very well. So go and see what else there is on creating architecture patterns. And if you do a search on Google, here's a search that I did for this webinar. Just put in architecture frameworks. Other search engines are available, and you'll find plenty that are popular. The Zachman Framework, for example, is a bit theoretical, but there's some good material there, and plenty of people are using it. There are also really good architecture frameworks for a lot of the government bodies around the world. Go and have a look and see what you can find. The second thing Togaf doesn't tell you. Togaf is presented a little bit like learn Togaf and that's it. You're trained. You're now an enterprise architect. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but Togaf is a really good foundation. It's a really good starting point. It's the best we have for giving you a common grounding in enterprise architecture, but it's not the end point. So being an enterprise architect is an ongoing process of learning. Every single project you do, every single situation you're dealing with will be different. You will not have covered it before. You might have to learn a whole host of new things. So if you're good at learning and you're prepared to put in a little bit of time and effort to keep your skills up to date, success will be more likely in your projects. And then the third thing that that Togaf doesn't really tell you, it spends a lot of time saying that we're talking about enterprise architecture. And what we mean by that is that you are trying to work out the best ways of structuring and organizing the component parts that make up an enterprise so that they work effectively. But in the old days, that was working really well. If you imagine once upon a time, people had standalone applications. There was no connection from a standalone application to any other application, any other database, and certainly no connections from an internal application within an organization to applications elsewhere. As time's gone on, we've become more and more connected. As we become more connected, the links between one enterprise and another have become greater and greater. So we all exist in these broad contexts. In some ways, you could say enterprise architecture as a discipline is important, but the context for architecture is not so much the enterprise as the whole environment, the whole community in which we operate. So good example of this is the whole use of the internet that transcends enterprise as a boundary. And if you think of what's happened when we've had COVID and the way in which we've responded, the key thing is that we all need to work. Every single country needs to work together. We all need to be vaccinated. We all need to control the spread of the disease. And it's not possible just for one country to do it on its own. It's the same thing for enterprise architecture. It used to be that enterprise architecture was just the enterprise, but increasingly it's not. So as you go through Togaf, learn what it's got to tell you, but remember that it's not the only architecture framework, it's not the end of your learning, and you're dealing with a broader context than just the boundaries within your enterprise. So we've looked at what it is to be successful and how Togaf can help. I talked about 7 characteristics of successful enterprise architecture projects. I looked at 10 things that are in the Togaf documentation that really will help you be successful, and the 3 things that Togaf certification doesn't mention. So let's have a look at the key takeaways before we open this to a discussion and look at your questions and answers. The key takeaways. You have to define what success means for you and for your architecture project. Successful projects share common characteristics. The more you have those characteristics in place, the more likely your success. Togaf really can help to ensure success, but remember, you have to be pragmatic. You have to adapt it to your needs. You have to supplement what Togaf gives you. Keep learning from as many different sources as possible. If you do a search on the internet, you will find all sorts of architecture frameworks, training programs, webinars, websites. YouTube's got plenty of stuff. Keep learning. So that's the webinar. Just a little reminder that Good eLearning offers a big portfolio of accredited courses. Enterprise architecture is obviously probably the key one that you'll be interested in, but they also cover business process, agile, digital transformation, change management, and a whole host more. One of the key things about Good eLearning that I really like is the fact that they bring in experts, subject matter experts, and professionals who've been doing these things for many years to help supplement the basic certification programs with additional material. In particular, the training that you can get from Good eLearning that's relevant to Togaf and enterprise architecture, the certifications for Togaf itself, levels 1 and 2, the business architecture aspects of Togaf, and then also things like Archimate, which is a very useful supplement to the meta model in Togaf, and things like IT for IT Foundation, which helps you in digital transformations. One other reminder here, if you use the code that's on your screen, Evernden-20, you can get 20% off all of those courses with that code. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure to help you and talk about the success factors in enterprise architecture. And now let's open to your questions and answers.
Okay, so there were quite a lot of questions came in ahead of the webinar, and there have been a few coming in as we've been going through. So what I'm going to try and do is go through those as quickly as possible. So hopefully I'll answer your question. Hopefully some of the tips that you saw during the webinar will help you, but let's go to some of the questions. So one of the questions was where to begin with Togaf. Well, one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is that enterprise architecture is all about understanding the concerns of your stakeholders. So understanding what the problems, the issues, all of those, understanding those, and then mapping them to the architecture. So when you map them to the architecture, what you're doing is saying, here's a concern. Maybe we're not getting enough customers taking on board a new product that we're trying to sell. So what you then do is map that to the architecture. You say, what is it in the current architecture that's causing that to be a problem or an issue? And then you look at the future architecture and say, what is the shape, the structure, the organization of the architecture that allows you to change that from a problem into a solution? So key thing, concerns, mapping them to the architecture. Path to certification. A couple of people asked how you get to be certified. Well, all of the learning objectives are defined by the open group. They structure the course. They provide all of the basic material that all of the training providers use to structure their courses. And then you'll find that pretty much all of the training providers follow the same basic pattern, the same basic path to train you up. So they go through all of the learning objectives that the Open Group define. One of the things I would emphasize is that Good e-learning are quite special in this respect because they provide that training. They do it online, so you can take it at your own pace. But the other thing I like very much is that they supplement that material that comes from the Open Group with a whole load of practical things, practical guidance and expert advice. So having that experience mentoring, having the subject matter experts will also help you to go to certification. Someone asked, could you pass the Togaf exam without the relevant understanding? I think it's unlikely. Although the Open Group exam is a multiple choice, and in theory, if you picked the right one of the answers, you could perhaps score a reasonable score. It's very important that you actually understand really what architecture is all about. And a lot of learning Togaf is actually knowing what the Open Group recommends. And that's what you're tested for in the certification. You're learning the world according to Togaf. So you have to kind of learn what it is that Togaf would like you to know about the architecture, and that will help you pass the exam. Someone was asking how you use Togaf to deliver success in a commercial or consulting setting. So it's actually fairly similar to applying it within your own enterprise. So the success factors tend to be more or less the same. One of the things that I'll emphasize there is that when you're really doing a true architecture project, remember those key things that I mentioned right at the beginning of the webinar. So it's going to be a lot of stakeholders, it's going to be a long duration, it's going to be a complex project, probably covering multiple domains. So providing you're aware of that and you try and put in place as many of the abilities and the right sort of setting to make that a success, that will help you a lot. And that's true for a consulting or a commercial success as well as for doing that within an enterprise. Something I emphasize a lot when I'm talking to people about architecture is to be able to think like an architect. And what I mean by that is you need to actually always map concerns to architecture. So if you can explain the concerns of someone in terms of the component parts of the architecture, their structure, the relationship between the component parts and how they behave, if you can explain the concerns in that way, then you're a long way towards being successful as an architect. So I keep talking about that as thinking like an architect. And if you do that with your clients, then hopefully you'll bring them on board to an architectural way of thinking, and you're more likely to have success, especially on large-scale projects. There are quite a few questions about how you use architecture with other disciplines, so Scrum and Agile and working in pods and things like that. So any architecture project is going to be a multidisciplinary project. And if you think of architecture as sitting above everything else that happens, so it's a little bit like an umbrella that covers all of these different disciplines, all of these different approaches and techniques, then that might help. I developed something called the levels of architectural understanding. And you can, if you do a search for that on the web, you'll find some writings that I've produced about that. But basically, it's a pyramid that places architecture at the top of the pyramid, and then you go through a number of levels. So the architecture sets the scene. It's the overall picture. Remember, architecture means above all, a way of looking across everything. And then you come down to design, and then you come down to development, and then you come down to operation and implementation. Those are the different levels of the architectural understanding. It's only the architecture that really is truly holistic and truly tries to take into account all of the different thinking and all of the different concerns across all of the stakeholders. As soon as you come down to design or development or implementation, then you're starting to get divides. So one of the key things about architecture is to be able to give you some principles, to give you some basic values, to give you some patterns that you can then cascade all the way down subsequent levels. And it's also architecture that when you go up the other way, so when you're looking at the diversity you have across systems and development and all the different development approaches, analysis approaches, architecture is a way of bringing those together. So if you have a particular application pattern or application design or an application you're trying to implement, you can look at that architecturally, you can see its structure and the elements and the behavior of those elements, and you can then take that pattern and shift it up a level and merge it with the architectural patterns for processes and for all of the other domain areas. So again, I would say if you're using Agile, you're using Scrum, these are great techniques. Just remember to think like an architect. Remember to share techniques and artifacts. If you have a really good artifact that explains what the architecture is doing, then you can use this across all of the development teams. And if you're in a truly networking development environment, as some pods environments are, then you can use the architectural framework to give some consistency and structure across independent self-managing teams. There are plenty of good books out on this. There's one which I can pass a link on to Good eLearning, which is about how organizational structures are changing. And one of the key changes is we're getting a lot more organizations that are having more networked structures and self-organizing team structures. So you only have to think of groups like Spotify and Netflix or Amazon. They provide good architectural ideas, and the book that I mentioned I'll get a link to Good eLearning, and you might find that useful to help explain this. Okay, so I mentioned about concerns mapped to the architecture. It's important to make sure that the artifacts and the deliverables all map to the architecture, that you explain what is problematic about the architecture. Essentially, if you think of taking concerns, you're translating them. You're like a language expert where your language is architecture. So you're taking concerns of people expressed in a multitude of different ways, and you're translating them into architectural speak, architectural language, which is talking about the constructs, talking about the way in which they're organized, the way in which they're structured, the way in which they're related to other constructs, the way in which they behave, and you're explaining how that works. Going back to linking with other teams, another team that you might need to liaise with is a strategy team, a business analyst team that are looking at the overall strategy of the organization. Togaf has some good material here where it talks about iteration, it talks about various levels of analysis. So you might do a very high level analysis around the ADM where you start with the business or the organizational strategies, and you get a high level view of what the overall development of the organization is likely to be over a good few years. And then you drop down to another level of detail and you perhaps go through the ADM at a more detailed level to understand a particular domain. So you might, once you've got the overall structure, you start developing the overall patterns, and then you drop down to the application domain or the business domain or the data domain, and you look at how that affects those people. I mentioned that you have to adapt to Togaf. That's important. How much do you adapt it was one of the questions. The simple answer is enough. You have to adapt it so that it meets your needs. I can't be more precise than that, but if you just remember that if it's working for you, then you've adapted it to your needs and it's working. If it's still not working, then perhaps there's something else that you need to adapt or add in or change. Quite a few people asked about metrics. Now, what metrics do you use? There is no particular metric that you can apply to all projects. One of the key things that you have to do is know what it is that you want to achieve. I talked about success factors right at the beginning of the webinar. So if you know what it is, if you've already set out your goals and objectives, then think about what metrics you would have to prove that you have actually met those objectives. So if one of your goals is to maybe you've got a legacy architecture which has got a whole load of processes which are heritage processes that have been around for years, same with applications. Maybe one of your key objectives is to simplify that landscape, to maybe reduce the number of applications or reduce the number of processes. One of the things you might be doing in the process area to do that is have a high-level template process that covered a lot of variant processes, and you might want to apply that high-level template so that you had some consistency across all the diverse processes. So your metric would be how many of the processes can be mapped to that higher level process template. So you have to really find the metrics that work for you. Key thing is about what do you want to achieve and are you achieving it? And I think another thing about metrics is to say, have a feedback loop. So when you measure things, sometimes maybe you don't achieve what it was that you're trying to do, then in that feedback loop, find out why you didn't achieve that and what can you change either in the architecture or in your approach to be more successful. Someone was asking about a startup and how you use enterprise architecture from the outset. Well, I would say the key things to remember again are thinking like an architect. If you can have your startup and right from the outset you have a holistic view of what it is you're trying to achieve, then you're halfway towards getting an effective architecture. And then making sure that you have the right qualities and skills to actually deliver on that. So you need people that have the skills, that understand how to map your requirements to the architectural structures that you're going to need to make this an effective project. You need people that have empathy, that have understanding, and that can manage multiple viewpoints. So let me just cracking on here. Several people were asking about what other standards, tools and techniques you can use to complement Togaf. Well, there are many, many of those. So again, if you think of that levels of understanding that I mentioned, where architecture is right at the top, it's the umbrella that covers everything. Architecture is a bit like a magpie. It will pick all sorts of techniques and models and approaches from all sorts of different disciplines. Enterprise architecture didn't magically appear from nothing. It grew out of all sorts of things that people were doing in structured analysis and programming and all sorts of other techniques. So you do the same thing with enterprise architecture today. You find that there are plenty of other techniques, COBIT, IT for IT, the business canvas, business model canvas from a business perspective. There are plenty of things there that you can either adapt for your architecture or you can use within a specific domain at lower levels of architectural understanding, map them to architectural patterns and then raise those up so you link between the lower level architectural patterns and the overall enterprise architecture patterns. There are all sorts of things you can use. The business analysis body of knowledge, BABOK. There's architectures for all sorts of industries, health industry, banking industry. They often have their own architectural frameworks or sub-domain information that you can use to help you. How do I see enterprise architecture changing? I'm appreciating we're running out of time, but I'll do these as quickly as I can. So how's enterprise architecture going to change in the future? Well, it's hard to predict, but what you can do is look at startup organizations and the architectures that they're putting in place. And that gives you a pretty good clue of the sort of direction that architecture is heading in the future. One of the key things that has changed and will continue to change is that we are all interconnected. Once upon a time, enterprise architecture was about standalone enterprises. Before that, enterprise architecture was about standalone applications, but increasingly we're more and more connected. So now it's much more about the enterprise in the context of its environment. And a lot more of that interaction in the environment is, rather than having hierarchical controls, you have more networked linkages and connections. So that's a general trend that you're going to find in enterprise architecture. But look at new startups and see what they're doing, and that will give you a pretty good clue of what might happen in the future. I mentioned about the metrics. One thing that I perhaps should mention is that there are also metrics for your own team that you can put in place to understand how well you're architecting. And again, if you look on internet searches, you'll find some tips and clues onto that. How do you get stakeholder buy-in? How do you get business stakeholders in particular to buy in? It's a bit like a lot of common sense approaches. If you've got something that makes sense to people, if you've got something which is so obvious that of course you do it, that's one of the best ways to get buy-in. So don't present enterprise architecture as something esoteric and difficult. It's actually something that's common sense. It makes sense to look holistically at how all sorts of things affect each other and try and come up with a common solution that meets everyone's needs. So that's one way to get buy-in. Another way to get buy-in is to come up with really good artifacts. If you can come up with a great artifact that explains the concerns and issues that the business stakeholders have, and it explains them better than they've ever seen it explained before, then you're going to get their buy-in. And there are various ways you can do that. Certainly start off by understanding their concerns, really understanding the concerns, mapping them to the architecture as it is, mapping them to the architecture that you're proposing. All of those are important. And if you get a really good diagram that you think has something you can leverage, then get a good graphic designer to turn it into something really, really special that you can use. So organization with less than 200 people, yes, okay. So the best strategy, okay. So if you've got a smaller organization, I don't have time to go into this in huge detail, but basically you scale things down. You do the same things. You always think like an architect. You always map needs to the architectural structures and components. But ultimately what you're doing is making sure that you're thinking like an architect, and you scale that down so you can work faster and be more agile. Roles and responsibilities. Okay, will enterprise architecture take on the role of a project manager? Well, you've kind of got a project manager role within enterprise architecture, but generally speaking, most organizations look at all of the different roles, look at the different people you need to work with, and see who's the best person to manage that. If you've got someone who really understands how to project manage, then you possibly don't want to waste an enterprise architect doing that. You want to give the enterprise architecture group the skills so that they can provide the artifacts and the deliverables that will help a project manager deliver your architecture. Okay, the Zachman Framework. Okay, the Zachman Framework. Yeah, the Zachman Framework was perhaps the original architecture framework. It still has a lot of value. It's got a lot of good material. The important thing is really thinking about that architecture as being the holistic thing that covers everything. One thing that you'll find with the Zachman Framework, it's got a number of different levels. Those levels were the levels for developing a standalone application. That's how the Zachman Framework originated. So if you look at the levels, they're really going from requirements right the way through to implementation, but it kind of implies that it's a standalone application. If you really want to understand that holistic linkage between all the different domains, then re-engineer the Zachman Framework so that it comes into a pyramid where all of the different domains are within the boundary of that pyramid. Again, if you search for levels of architectural understanding, you'll find some things that I've written on that, and hopefully they'll help you. An example of a project you've worked on, I can address that instance. Well, there are plenty of examples that I could go through. I think I've kind of run out of time, but I'm happy to talk about example projects with anyone at some stage in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Roger. Just a reminder to everyone, the recording will be available tomorrow. And for any questions that have not been answered, we will release the answers in a piece of content on our blog. So please keep your eyes peeled for that. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and good night.